Welcome everyone to our book notes this evening. We want to welcome everyone in. We've got people from around the country. I want to give a shout out to Mobile, Alabama, to Stone Mountain, Georgia. I believe we have folks from California in the house, also in Indiana. Of course, Illinois. We have Woodleaf, North Carolina. We are grateful that you are with us this evening. Shout out to Atlanta, GA in the house. We thank you that we've got this national group. They got Hyde Park here. Yes, we know you're here in Hyde Park. I'm your host this evening, Otis Moss III, for our book notes. This is our first book notes of 2026. And we welcome you to be here this evening for this conversation. I am looking forward to the conversation that we are going to have this evening with our author, our guest, our professor and sage, Dr. Stephanie Crumpton. Before we begin our conversation, let us first center ourselves in a word of prayer, and then we will move to our conversation with our special guest. Let us go to God in prayer. Gracious and most merciful God, in whom we live, move, and have our very being, we are grateful. We're grateful that you are a God that provides pathways to healing from trauma. We check in this evening with you as we prepare for this conversation and ask for your spirit to rest upon us. And in the words of the South Central poet by the name of Kendrick Lamar, we recognize that we're going to be all right. And so we ask, oh Lord, that you would bless this conversation, this book notes this evening, and the word that goes forth tonight will be an opportunity for people to check in, to heal, and to be blessed by not only knowledge, but also action and also practical habits that lead toward healing. We thank you and we offer this prayer in the name of Jesus. We pray, and the people all across the nation who recognize the love that flows from God, they say amen. We welcome you here this evening for our book notes. I want to introduce our author and our guest tonight, none other than Dr. Stephanie Crumpton. Dr. Stephanie Crumpton is professor at McCormick Theological Seminary, specializing in trauma. She's a professor in around the area of practical theology, a graduate of Langston University, also the Interdenominational Theological Center, and also Chicago Theological Seminary. We are grateful for her witness and for her work and for this book that we are going to be talking about tonight. We gonna be all right. Resistance and Healing in Black Movement Spaces 2012 to 2021. And we welcome this evening none other than Dr. Stephanie Crumpton.
Thank you so much, Pastor Moss. It's wonderful to be here with you all. I'm excited.
Well, we are excited to have this conversation this evening, especially this wonderful publication that you have put together. We have people from across the nation who are joining us, who want to hear about your work. And I want to begin with this question. What was the genesis of the creation of this work?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me. I'm super excited. The genesis of this was actually the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. I was starting my first semester on faculty at Lancaster Seminary, the summer/fall that they were killed. And what really kind of spiked my interest, of course, paying attention to their deaths, but was more than anything else was my students, my seminary students. I had quite a few activists and organizers who were also seminary students. And I watched them running up and down the East Coast, back and forth between Pennsylvania and Ferguson, Missouri. And I watched them struggle with the questions that they require that we as faculty wrestle with, which is, why do these books matter? what does any of this have anything to do with these bodies who are laid out in the street?
Mm,
So that was first, their theological questions was the first thing that brought me to this. But more pressingly, quite honestly, was the condition that I noticed them in as they were going back and forth between the streets, protests, classwork. In particular, there were several students who I knew they were exhausted. They were dealing with having, at that time, remember, part of the protest was actually lying their bodies down in the street in honor of those who had been slain in the street, doing die-ins. So they were literally laying their bodies down in front of police, driving, taking trains, coming all the way back, and then coming to class and trying to perform.
mm,
And many of them were exhausted, and they were oftentimes reluctant to ask for extensions on assignments or more time or to take an incomplete because they just were having such a hard time. And it occurred to me that part of my work, because I too was trying to figure out what's my role in this moment, because it felt a little worthless to be teaching in a classroom when bodies are being laid out in the streets.
mm.
However, I remember thinking my call is to figure out how to be caring and supportive of them as they're going back and forth. And that's how it began. Really, it started with bodies in the street, students who were wrestling theologically, and then students themselves who were wrestling with their own mental health, their own relationships within movement space, how to be a friend, a partner, and an activist and organizer.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. Now, in your book, you come from a very specific space and perspective, womanist practical theology. For those who may not be
Mhm.
familiar, could you share with us what does that mean, womanist practical theology?
Yeah, the easiest way for me to say it is that it's this academic term that has been used to describe what Black women have been doing always. And what we've been doing is paying attention to what matters most to us in our communities, who we love, who we are loved by, the condition of our communities, the various social and economic, political forces that impact our capacity to be whole, to be well, our sense of dignity, all of those things, and those ways that we resist every single day, right? Like the ways
Mm.
that your mom and your grandmama and them taught you how to how to
Hmm.
take care of yourself and how to push against that which would, as we say, beset you. Womanist work is really just paying attention to those things and formalizing it on paper, but it's nothing new.
Hmm.
Black women have been caring about ourselves and our community and being loved by our communities forever. It just means that we take more seriously the everydayness of our ways of being as ways of thinking about the larger problems of society, theology, psychology, religion. That's a way to frame it, but really is Mama Nim's wisdom, Mama
Mm.
Nim's ways of knowing
Womanist
spirit,
wisdom.
taking it seriously as opposed to adopting the ways of someone else's culture and worldview that are foreign for us.
Mm. And with that in mind, we're going to make a shift.
Okay.
Um, and we're going to make a shift. Someone in the chat put a statement, Brother James. I want to let you know that we hear and see you. Brother James was speaking about self-harm. And we want to let you know we love you and we care for you. I'm going to ask that our team would gather his information and make sure that Brother James gets connected to the right people so that we can see you continue to thrive, Brother James. Thank you for putting your hand up for help at this moment. Got me a little bit emotional. Um, in terms of
If I
that,
may,
please.
alongside of that, first off, it is courageous, James, for you to even speak out in a space to say, I don't care what's going on, I need help, I'm here for help. Pastor Moss, thank you for acknowledging it and not skipping over it. I know our folks behind the scenes are working carefully to respond. One of the things we might want to do to our folks behind the scene is include the national hotlines for suicide prevention, the NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. There are a few hotlines that we can access. I can't see the chat right now, but those are a couple of things to our folks who are behind the scenes. If you want to take a look at those national hotlines, they're accessible. They're 24 hours and they're nationwide.
Thank you for that, Dr. Crumpton. I'm going to ask the team
Mhm.
that is present but is behind the scenes if you also would post that information, but please let us reach out to Brother James, and we want to see you We want to see you thrive. We want to see you well. We want to make sure that you are safe. And I'm grateful that you shared this in this space at this moment. And you just did Womanist Practical Theology, Dr. Crumpton.
This is that. We've done it together. We have done the
Yes,
Black thing together.
yes. You've done Womanist Practical Theology, and it kind of leads me to a question. I'm shifting some of the questions that I was going to ask, but
Sure.
leads me to the question in reference to trauma, because much of your book is about how we hold trauma, how we experience trauma, and we use that term a lot. You hear people use that term, but when you say trauma, what is trauma? How does it affect us? And what is Black trauma? And what does that mean?
Yeah. Let me just make sure I get everything down. What is it? How does it affect us? And what about, in particular, about Black trauma?
Mhm.
So a couple of distinctions. I appreciate you asking this question because the term gets bounced around a lot and we aren't always clear about what it means. The first thing that we want to recognize is that trauma is not the actual event of something happening, because every time something painful, disastrous, difficult happens, it does not always create trauma. Trauma is the long-term, prolonged impact of a traumatic, of a difficult experience, of a threat, of harm. It's generally characterized. Thank you so much. Devona has put the NAMI hotline in the chat, as also a local trauma therapist and a very good friend of mine. I appreciate her. We're doing womanist work through and through right now. Trauma is generally characterized by events that overwhelm the sense and the ability to be able to act and defend yourself off against a threat. Right? That's the event that can cause different physiological changes in the moment. Trauma is when those physiological symptoms, things like dissociation, things like hypervigilance, those kinds of things, that's the result of the body's physiology getting stuck in that moment. Right. And so after the moment is over, what can happen is that some of those physiological things that happen, they can continue to happen if the impact of the event isn't talked through, if the person doesn't have support, if the person doesn't have certain kinds of kind of like a backlog of protective measures that allow them to be able to face certain things, feel it, move through it, but then reestablish a safer baseline. It's really most of the time what we talk about when we talk about trauma is the impact of the event, the physiological stuff. The sense people will tell a story as if they were there, but kind of looking down on it. That's dissociation. When someone continues to re-experience an event, even though it is in the past, that can show up in flashbacks, that can show up physiologically in hypervigilance, always scanning the environment to see if what happened before can happen is going to happen again. It's essentially a disruption of one's physiological, social, and I would say spiritual baseline for feeling like you're okay. And so that's a way of thinking about trauma. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association has a wonderful explanation of it. NAMI, which Dr. Devona just put in the chat, they also have great ways of looking at it too. So there are pretty much several. They kind of land on the sense of it's a disruption of what life is, and it has psychological, physical, and spiritual consequences. It has social consequences. You don't trust the world as safe and reliable. It doesn't make sense anymore. Yeah. So I think that's a kind of a way of looking at what it is. I think I talked a little bit about its impact. When we talk about Black trauma, there are a few ways to talk about that. I think it's important to recognize that when we say Black trauma, part of what, but not all of what we're talking about, part of what we're talking about is historical trauma that is particularly experienced by Black people because we are Black. It's not kind of an abstract, it can happen to anybody. It is the political systems, the macro level systems. It is the interpersonal experiences in which we are harmed physically, psychologically, spiritually, by virtue of the fact that someone has problem with our race and skin color, right? Things that we cannot change, and I personally don't have a desire to either, right? Just want to name that. Things that you can't get away from it, right? It's a part of, and that's part of what makes it so difficult. You cannot not be the color that you are,
Mm,
right? Which means that you consistently are a target for those who are targeting people of color, targeting Black people. And it's not random acts of violence or random systemic oppression. It is targeted oppression
mm,
and acts of violence towards specifically Black people, Black progress, Black life, Black freedom, Black identity, Black bodies,
mhm,
Black futures.
mm. Now, you used a jumping off point in your introduction, Carol Anderson, when she talks about the idea that Black advancement is what
Mhm.
causes white rage, and
Mhm.
therefore is the jumping off point that ends up creating Black trauma. How do we experience this? You lift it up in a couple of points in your book in terms of how we carry it in our body,
Mhm.
how we negotiate the world, how we even define certain ideas and concepts. How do we experience this specifically as people of African descent?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways that we can look at that. Historically, many of us who lived in the South, when we owned property, we were
Hmm.
run off of property, or run off from that property because they wanted the land, because you weren't supposed to be a Black person with land, which meant you were on par financially with white people, right? So you see this and Reconstruction, Jim and Jane Crow, right? So that's one way. If we continue to move down the line, and the piece that I actually work with in the book is that the penultimate moment in which we see this is the amount of racial animus that reactivates. It's always been there, but it kind of like busted out the gates a bit with the physical positioning of an African American family in the White House and an African
Hmm.
American man in the penultimate
Hmm.
position of world power. Psychologically, and I think this is what Carol Anderson and others are pointing to, is that there is something that happens psychologically that disrupts um, the impact, the equilibrium, right? The social equilibrium. And that happens in the minds of persons who are deeply committed to white supremacy. That it's not just white supremacy as an idea, it's white supremacy as an identity. And white
Mm,
supremacy as an identity means that you're supposed to hold all the power at all times, and you should always be the one in the position of power and authority. The actual image and reality of a Black family in the White House,
mm,
of a Black man with his finger on the nuclear weapon, a Black man who also had the capacity to create peace. That was a problem psychologically for those
mm,
who have deeply embedded commitments to white supremacy, not just socially, but I would also argue psychologically. And so the
mhm,
racial animus that has always been a part of this American history was stirred up by that, just that actual imagery. So of course I'm
mm,
clearly looking at this psychologically, that
mm,
like it actually is there and is stirred up in ways that I think sometimes surprise people who are committed to white supremacy, that the level
mhm,
of violence,
mhm,
when we look at not just Barack Obama and Michelle Obama and the Obamas as people, but as symbols. What does this mean? That suddenly there are Black people who are running the country and not serving the food or building the building,
my.
right?
Mm,
I think that's one of the places, and then it had a shutter effect that, like, all of a sudden we saw an increase in police violence. We saw again some of the things that we've seen in the past, a resurgence of church burnings, all of the different things that we had thought perhaps we had read about and that it was a part of the past. There was a resurgence, which meant it was always there. But
mhm.
there was a tipping point, I believe. If I look at this through the lenses of psychology and psychological theory, there's something that happens in the mind that kind of knocks something off of the shelf of identities that are coalesced around white supremacy as an organizing identity.
So, would you agree with this statement based on what you said? The creation of the MAGA monster is directly connected to Black advancement, Black space, Black excellence, Black joy is what we are seeing now, the pendulum swinging in a different direction because Black people expressed themselves in a particular way?
We could. I'd have to actually ask the MAGA folk to really get deeply into it.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not sure if it's the pendulum swinging the other way so much as trying to reclaim what has always been. We
Hmm.
have to remember, and I've heard you talk about this often, MAGA is nothing new, it's just a new label.
Mhm.
But these are some of the same tactics that we read about. It's odd, I will say, that at 49 years old, after I read about these things, now I'm actually living through it. Right, so none of this is new. I'm not sure that this is a matter of the pendulum swinging so much as, "Oh, this is a time for us to perhaps reclaim our place and our assumption," and it's further. I think there's a level of angst that is involved when we actually look at the demographics of this country and how they are shifting, and there's perhaps a sense of a threat of annihilation going on. There's a lot happening over there. But what
Mm.
I will say is that I don't think it's a matter of the pendulum swinging. I think this is a matter of what has always been there, just kind of it almost rolls like a storm, right? It
Mm.
comes, and then for a few decades, it sits a little bit lower beneath the surface because we've never been without racial violence. We've never been without this kind of commitment to genocide in this country. Like we've never been without that. But I think it just kind of roars. It
Mm.
sits and waits and roars and peaks at different times.
Mm.
None of this is new. So I wouldn't say this is the pendulum. I think this is just the next iteration.
The next iteration, or mutation of whatever it may be, of what we're experiencing. You do something that I love in the book. You have conversation with some
Mhm.
wonderful activists, and I'm going to ask you the question first, and then I would like for you to communicate some of the things that they shared with you. Um, if I say the word hope,
Yeah, I know
how
exactly where you're with this. That's a rough one. I'll say, I started working on this book in 2014, and
Mhm,
when you commit yourself to a project, you give yourself over to it. So at one point, I was dead right there with them, like, "Wait, we're not concerned about no hope."
mhm,
And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. What I will say is I'm back to a space of reclaiming what hope has to be, because
mhm,
the alternative, I think there's a way in which when things are not as hot, we have the luxury of perhaps thinking about whether or not we can be hopeful. But as
mm,
we are right, and I'm also very aware that some people may be able to make that choice, meanwhile others are never had that luxury of
mhm,
being able to imagine not having to focus on hope. So let me own that privilege that's within me. I would say that right now, hope is not like I'm fighting, I'm pushing, I'm delighting in the possibilities of hope that I find in conversations with people that matter in a world that is so obsessed with conversations that don't matter right now.
mm.
Right? Like, or for me, let me rephrase that. Let me use I language. I am interested in the
Take that a little
conversations
further.
that
Unpack that for us. Conversations that do not matter. Would love to.
yes. Your people are they're about to get a little bit more than me than I thought I was gonna offer. Yeah, I'm not concerned with the conversations within Black communities that run on a motor that is about pitting us against each other, because then I
Mm,
feel like it's a distraction.
mm,
Because then I feel like we're fighting each other, and now we've done white supremacy's work, and they just can just go ahead on now because
mm,
we're now stuck
mm,
in their work, right? So I'm not interested in conversations that are not where we revisit some of the old patterns of um, of oppression, even within our own communities. I'm not
mm,
interested in that. I'm hopeful when I look at our artists who are out here. Of course, folks like Kendrick Lamar, who the book is named after him. I'm hopeful when I look at our artists who are creating visual art that is a conversation in and of itself, that reminds us of what has been in the past, like this whole thing that's going on in art around making these collages, and you'll see something that's like a picture from the 20s and 30s, but then it's got this color and these different textures that are now, and we talk about them as things that come from us. I'm excited about conversations when I actually get to sit down with someone that I've known for years and I get to learn something new about them.
Mm,
I'm
mm,
excited when I stop, and this has actually been happening lately a lot more, and I think it's a sign of what makes us hopeful when we stop and pay attention to the people who are in front of us and
mhm,
actually say, "How are you?" Especially the people who are in the service industry, to actually stop for a minute
mm,
and ask them how they're doing, not just, "Hey, how you doing? Give my money," or "Give me this, give me that," but actually
mhm,
say, "Hey, how are you?" Before they take stop them, right? Before they take your order, say, "Hey, how are you?" And stop and listen,
yes.
right? I'm
Mm,
interested in those are the moments, that give me hope, because the hope is about that we're connecting. It's not that our condition has changed, right? I don't know what, because like I feel like we're at the beginning of some much more worse stuff that's about to
mm,
happen for a while.
mm, mm,
So I can't count on hope coming from our condition and our context, but I can count on us, right?
mm,
I can count on us about hope. So that's that.
mm,
That's me about hope. I think you're probably you're I laugh every time I think about this. My first person that I interviewed in the book, and she's in, I think, the second chapter
yes.
about mental health, life on the high wire. Her name is Anana Harris, beautiful human being in Atlanta, um, activist, organizer. She has a group called the Self Care Agency, and she first, wrote about this work of self care. And I asked her in my good Christian way, I was being a good Christian clergy woman. I was like, so tell me about hope. Is hope how do you all maintain your hope? And she looked at me and without blinking or smiling said, that's not what I'm concerned with. Hope is not what keeps us in these streets. She said it's her sense of determination. It's her sense
Mm,
of fidelity to the ancestors. It's her sense of fidelity to a sense of calling that spirit is telling her to do something. It's not hope. And she kind of rocked my, she kind of shook my rack a little bit right there with that one, because I didn't realize the assumption I was carrying into the conversation, right? And
mhm,
a lot of the book, there are a few points where I talk about, I had some assumptions that I knew some things, and then listening to these people carefully enough, realized that ain't it, stuff. You got to back up.
mm,
And so they talk about, which is an important moment for a clergy woman to have, right? Like, because we kind of have these, even we liberation folk, we kind of think we kind of keep in our back pocket that we know what things should be.
mm,
But these folks are like, that's not it. It's determination. And she also launches a critique of the church where she actually says that she's concerned about folks of faith and who may be in church or not, who are always talking about hope and we want hope. And she says that people are going to church and they're excited about hope. But she said, I need somebody out here working with me. And so
mm,
hope becomes a
mm,
byproduct, the outcome of the work, but hope is not the engine, right?
mhm.
And so that rocked me a bit. I'm gonna tell you, it was a very humbling experience. And that was a good disorientation that continued to guide my conversations with them.
So is let me ask this, as you stirred something when you said that. Is the definition of hope presented theologically in the Western world disembodied from there needs to be a new definition is what I'm saying. Is when Ubuntu is offered, that's a very different framing. You offer in the book Sankofa, that's a different framing. And hope seems to be disembodied in the West, like a
Yeah.
sitcom hope. Um, you work through it, and hey, here it is. What is this? What is the term? Is it Sankofa? What is the term? Is it determination? Is it what is the frame that
Yeah.
speaks to the
So
resilience?
so I hear a couple of things. I hear you asking about a frame and I hear you asking about concepts and terms. And
Mhm,
so part of it is I'm not always sure
mhm,
what the word is, because I think part of what we're dealing with is the need for new language to talk about where we are right now. And so I'm reluctant to say it's this or it's that.
okay.
I think a lot of people are doing some real thinking about what's going on in these streets. The activists and organizers that I talked with are doing some real thinking about the language and ways of being and identity making and meaning making that have been a part of their formation, and starting to ask some questions about that. So I'm reluctant to say this is exactly the thing, but what I can say is I want people, I would hope, and this is what happened for me. I had to sit down and think about, what do I feel in this moment, and what are the words? How can I create language to describe? How can I trust myself enough to come up with new language to describe what I am experiencing if the own language is not precise enough, if it's not broad enough, if it just doesn't cut it, right? So I'm interested in new language cut on the spot. So if there's a frame, I think the frame is about innovation related to what we feel. Because part of it, as you talk about a disembodied hope, if you're in your body, it's harder to create language about a reality that isn't your own. But if you're in your body, and part of what trauma does is forces a split between our bodies, and we question whether or not we can trust our bodies, because our bodies can consistently be reliving the experience. But if we can be in our bodies well enough to let our bodies help us create sounds and breath that constitute language,
Yes.
I think that that is where we can start having the sounds that allow us to communicate this thing that we have previously identified as hope. And that's a bit of fancy footwork, but part of it is also like, I'm not sure that the theological underpinnings and the theological assumptions and requirements about how hope has been talked about in the Christian tradition and in churches is really a good fit for what folks are grappling with right now.
There's a second question that I asked.
Mhm.
So if I say the word despair,
Mhm.
how do you negotiate, speak of, frame that? When you did that both for that community of activists, but I would
Yeah.
like to hear how you share it, and then how did they share it?
I didn't do a lot of sharing because I was supposed to be in a listening posture. So I tried very hard not to. I think I asked them about it, about despair.
I was thinking about
And they,
you sharing, in this context, and then terms of their context.
yeah.
Mm,
Despair is like falling through the floor and there's never a bottom that you hit.
mm, mm. Wow.
It's like it's
Mm,
it's not just a trap door, because like you assume if there's a trap door, you're gonna hit the bottom, right? Like if
mm,
there's going to be a
mm,
bottom.
mm, mm,
And that's why despair and depression are kind of like cousins, if not siblings, right? It is this sense of there is no end to this suffering.
mm,
So that's what makes despair a particularly difficult and at times dangerous experience, not just emotion, but it's an experience. And so that's how
mm,
I think about despair. And I think that despair is also one of the things that makes despair most difficult is that often, but not always, oftentimes despair is also facilitated by isolation and alienation. When you got to
mm,
deal with the bad stuff by yourself, there's nobody there to catch you. There's nobody there to, put a net when you're falling. And so I think part of what makes despair so difficult is isolation.
mm,
Which often happens when people are dealing with, the impact of trauma, the impact of loss, the impact of profound grief and mourning. And when you have to deal with it by yourself, it can be unbearable, right?
mm,
And so despair is it's bad.
mm,
It's bad out here, right? And so I think one of the ways that I heard activists and organizers talking about it was around their mental health again,
mm,
right? And part of it having to do with the difficulty of riding the highs and lows as individuals and also as communities of resistance. In that same second chapter, there's a lot going on in that second chapter around mental health. There's an
mm.
organizer from Ohio, DeMario,
Yes.
and he talks about, yeah, he's a
Mm,
wonderful guy.
mhm,
He shared so powerfully, and one of the things in his stories that he talks about is that they are at a candidates forum and they're pushing for police reform. because there had been several instances, I think of what they called, they had a program called like Jump Out Boys or something like that in Ohio, and they're trying to push the political candidates to deal with this, and they feel like they're making headway. And literally, while the candidates forum is happening, there is a young boy, less than 15 years old, who is shot and killed by police. Now, this is the same state and not that far from Tamir Rice, who had been killed. So despair, I think, has a particular capacity to rob not just safety, but joy and possibility. I think that's what makes despair so hard. It snatches it snatches possibility. And so here they are. It looks like they're making progress, right, in this candidates forum, and at the same time, there is another incidence of the thing that they're actually fighting for, trying to live in that tension, right? That's a mountain high despair, bottom falling out low kind of thing. The highs can be so high and the lows can be so low that it has an impact on your sense of like, is it worth it? Is it gonna work ever? Right? And those are the kinds of things that can send us into despair, especially if we have to deal with it seemingly alone. Or what I would also say is for leaders who do not have spaces to say that this is bad and I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't know if it's going to ever matter, because of the idea that they're supposed to be a leader and that they're supposed to be able to lead others. And how can they lead others if they're struggling with despair? Or how can they lead others if they don't feel hopeful? And that's that isolation that can happen.
Wow. We have some questions in the chat. They have some extraordinary questions that people have for you, and we've just I feel like you have a bunch of your students here that
I
are
do.
asking.
I see a few of them. Students, former students, friends. Yes, and I really appreciate them.
I'm seeing some real sophisticated theological questions here. But we have Tiffany has a question that there are a number of studies that show that trauma can be stitched into your DNA, epigenetics. Even if a Black person has not experienced a blatant racist experience for themselves, would you agree that the media coverage of racial violence and inequities awaken trauma responses they never knew they had inside?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because there's a clinical component to the question, and then there's also what I think I can say without talking to somebody specifically about their experience. I'm always mindful of that. So the piece around stitching to your DNA, epigenetics, those studies actually started, and I was just talking to somebody about this. Some of the earliest communities that started looking at the transgenerational transmission of trauma were indigenous, Native
Mm,
Americans, and also descendants of the Holocaust, Jewish people. And looking at what they would notice is that these people would have a sense of angst, fear, and they weren't there, right? And so what is happening? So part of it, it may be the science is showing that it's handed down in the DNA. I think another part of it is that we also share stories. We share stories and we share practices and behaviors that aren't always connected to the stories. And so part of what I think may be happening is that because I don't feel comfortable getting all the way into the DNA, but I can point you to the science and we can read for yourselves. But what I can say is that when we raise children and we're being raised, there are certain practices that we will raise our children with, but we don't always tell the story about why that practice is important. And over
mm,
time, like, so a great example is that we tell when somebody's learning how to drive. I don't have children, but I've heard parents talk about this. They're teaching their kids how to drive, Black children, and they tell them if you get pulled over, put your hands on the wheel, turn your lights on, don't make any, sudden movements. Now, given the amount of police shootings, most young people know why that is. But if perhaps somebody isn't in that environment, they happen to be raised in a safer, presumably safer environment, but we teach them these things, but we don't tell them that this is because there have been police shootings or there has been a family story of uncle so and so or aunt so and so who was dragged out of their car, right? We might just tell them, keep your hands on the wheel, do all these things, but we don't tell the story. But there is something about how we hand those instructions down There's something of warning, there's something, an awareness of terror, there's awareness of threat that is being handed down in those lessons, right? And so half the time, we don't even know why we're doing things protectively. We just know this is a thing. And half the time, we don't recognize it as a protective thing. So
Mm-hmm.
there are ways in which we have, for sake of survival, handed out ways of preserving ourselves, making sure that we're safe. That then and of itself can keep you on edge. You don't even realize that you're on edge. Just as
Yes.
this is what you do when you're walking down the street. This is what you do when you're driving down the street, right? So that I think there are two ways to look at it, which is to study the science around epigenetics, but also think about the messages that we hand down in our families about how to keep ourselves safe, the different kind of prohibitions. You don't do this, you don't do that. Well, why? Well, when you're a kid, you're also not allowed to, oftentimes not allowed to ask why. You just don't do it because your parents told you not to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just you don't do this, but there's something also, there's another layer that's not spoken, but that's very much felt, right? That for one, you're going to get in trouble if you disobey. But for two, there's also just a tinge of something else that's warning about something else that's ominous there. That, but you know it's for your safety, but you don't know why. And so handing down those things. In our family, we have a saying that came from our grandfather. He would say, stay ready so you don't have to get ready, which is wonderful. It also keeps you on the edge of your seat at all times, right? And then like it can't be like if something happens to you, it's your fault because you weren't ready. Like it's a thing. You know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there are ways in which we hand these things down, as well as the things that are handed down genetically, because trauma does change our brain chemistry, it changes our physiology, it
Mm-hmm.
changes our metabolic constitution. So when
Mm.
we start looking at our metabolic disorders like around diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, all of those things are related to the stress hormones that are released in times of distress and, of course, trauma. If you have generations of bodies that are living with that and we're procreating, we're going to hand down that brain chemistry
Yes.
also. That's another way to think about it as well.
We have a question from Deacon Vince Price. There's a small percentage of African American therapists in Chicago. Uh, Deacon Vince has been so committed to mentoring young people for years. And I just want to
Yeah.
say that we're just very grateful for the work
Yeah.
that Deacon Vince has provided, that he mentors young people that are not comfortable sharing with their white therapists, with any white therapist may. Any suggestions for seeking help?
Yes. So there is the National Association of Black Psychologists here in Chicago. They will be able, which you can look at their website. They're a national association, but there's a Chicago chapter. So if you're looking for resources for therapists and also community groups, enrichment opportunities, that's a place to start.
Mhm.
Also for girls and women, young women, there is a group online called Therapy for Black Girls, where folks can look there and find out if there is somebody that they can get in touch with. You can kind of screen them. A lot of those therapists
Mm.
also have an opportunity where, for one, they'll list all of their insurance, you know, what they take, what they accept. They'll list also their specialties. You can book a intro conversation, so a young person and their parent, you know, can sit down and kind of try it out for, you know, for a session to see if it's a good fit, those kinds of things. I know there are also, I would say very much so, that checking with the National Association of Black Psychology, the Chicago chapter, is a great place to start.
Mm. Thank you. Jada has a question, Jada Thompson. When it comes to Black trauma, do you think that Black trauma can also be connected to things like ableism, sexism, etc.?
I love that question. Sister Jada is asking about my favorite term and concept, intersectionality. So yes, I think that when we say Black trauma, I think it's a social term that becomes an umbrella for to help us start putting our hands on the different forms of oppression that Black people experience. And one of the things I think is one of the gifts that Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the attorney who came up with the concept
Mhm.
intersectionality, is that she says that if you stand in the middle of an intersection, I've kind of adapted this too. And for folks on the South Side, you'll really get this. South Side Chicago, folks, stay with me. If somebody is standing in a three-way intersection, most intersections are two streets, but there are some streets in Chicago in particular where there are three streets. Like, for example, Stony and 79th and South Chicago. If you're from Chicago, you know about that intersection. The old Regal Theater used to be over there to the right. To the left, there's the White Castle. And you pray to God that you do not miss the light, okay? Or the person in front of you is not confused. Should you get hit in that intersection, you're going to get hit perhaps from the car in front of you, the car behind you, the car from the left of you, the car from the
Mm,
right of you, and the car that's coming in both directions
mm,
diagonally across. If that body, if that person is taken to the hospital and the surgeon says, tell me about how this person was hit, and they've got bruises all over their body, broken bones all over their body. If one of those streets was named racism and it
mm,
broke their leg,
mm,
but the other street was named heteronormativity transphobia,
mm,
the diagonal street, and it broke
mm,
their arm, but then the other street was named ableism and classism, does the surgeon not need to know every angle from which they have been harmed? Right? This is a way of thinking about intersectionality. And I use that as an example because the ways in which Black trauma has, I call them cousins, the oppression cousins, right? They're all related. They're all interlocking web. They constitute an interlocking web of oppression. And so if you contend only with how I'm impacted by racism, but you don't contend with the fact that within Black space,
mm,
there may be some, sexism, misogynoir, right? Then okay, I'm okay. You all, the community will defend me against whiteness, but
mm.
inside, I might have to defend myself
My, my,
against
my.
against misogynoir, right? Against sexism, right? And that goes for all of what we identify as the identifiers of our social locations. So to Jada, who asked the question, Black trauma is an umbrella for helping us perhaps think about the various ways in which Black bodies are harmed, and that harm does not always and only come from outside of the Black community. We got some
Mm,
in-house work to do, which is my primary concern in this book, about who and how we will be to and with one another as we move through this and in moments when we're on the other side of things. Because if we don't pay attention to every way in which we're harmed, we're
mm,
replicating, right,
mm.
white supremacist logic. We're saying that some Black bodies or some parts of a single Black body is important, but the other part isn't.
My. I need our producers to put a shout emoji on that one. That Chicago intersection piece is just spot on. I love that. That's brilliant. That is brilliant.
I
That is
will thank the folks in my pastoral care class last spring, one of whom is Antonio King, and we took it up on the north side to talk about where Milwaukee intersects, because now we got to deal with, as an out queer man, right? Where are the
wow.
intersections there? So
Yes.
contextualizing it, you can try the traffic roundabouts, the whole nine.
Mm, Oh, I love that. I will be quoting you and Antonio King when I utilize that in the future. We have
Mhm.
a question from Jasmine. How do we prepare the next generation of organizers, not just to fight, but to live well fighting?
Yeah. Jasmine, thank you so much for the question. Jasmine or Jamise, I'm not sure, but I want to make sure I acknowledge their name correctly. Part of the thing that I love the most about doing this project was what I learned from activists and organizers about how particular groups of them are committed to working on just what you're asking about, right?
Mm,
To live well while fighting sounds like it doesn't make sense. It sounds like a paradox. It doesn't seem to make sense, except for the fact that it does because we've been doing it, right? So, one of the things that many of them are doing is the examining the paradigms for leadership and the paradigms for being an activist and organizer, those paradigms that have been handed to them, and in examining it through an intersectional lens, so saying, okay, for whom does that work and for whom doesn't it work? They've also been very critical about recognizing that they don't have to do the same things that were done before, right?
mm, mm,
Really They've been doing some work that I absolutely adore about reading. They're reading feminist theology. They're reading womanist theology. They're reading about what were the mistakes and pains and difficulties of previous generations of activists and organizers. They're reading Ella Baker, right?
Mm,
They're reading the voices that had not been as prominent in the histories of civil rights and Black Power movements. They are reading um, Maynard Jackson, like they're reading to find out these voices that have been pushed in the side. They're reading to understand the context then as a lens for understanding what we're dealing with now. And so, what I would say is paying attention. If you're leading in a way that you know is giving you a problem, think about what is it that's making it problematic and trust yourself enough, right, to say something about this don't feel good. This isn't just oppression, but there's something else going on in
mm,
here,
mhm,
and invite folks into conversation, which is what folks have been doing. Another thing that I love is that they are taking the political and making it personal, which I know normally we say the personal is political. I want to back up and say that they are doing a lot of work on abolition, right? And that they are expanding abolition beyond just what it means in terms of the criminal justice system. They're examining carceral logics and how they operate amongst themselves in terms of the ways in which they notice punishment happening in their inner circles, right? They're thinking about if we can let go, or first of all, notice how carceral logics are kind of functioning amongst how it's functioning within the house, within activist and organizing space. They're starting to call that into question. And that abolition isn't just about getting rid of the police and not calling the police when there's a problem, but coming up with alternative ways of different dealing with conflict. And these are not soft ways. I want to be real clear. When some of their tools are restorative justice, philosophy and practice, abolitionist ways of being. These are not things that are soft on crime, right? These are things that are requiring that we don't just lock somebody away, but that are requiring some real accountability.
mm,
They're requiring coming up with solutions that don't rely on the same trains of thoughts that have been detrimental to Black communities, right? Getting away from white supremacist ways of thinking that the only way to correct someone is to punish them, and the only way
mhm,
to have community is to put someone out or everybody thinks the same, right? They are taking the political nature of abolition and examining what it is to be emancipated from a carceral logic on the inside of themselves and as they
mhm,
relate to one another, which then frees up the space to ask about the impact of grind culture on how people understand is their responsibility to do this work. This kind of notion that if I'm for my people, I must die for my people, which is one of the things DeMario is critiquing
mhm,
in chapter 3. They're looking at ways of what do they do? They're taking very seriously
mhm,
their anger, taking very seriously their rage, and examining. One person actually in a further chapter that talks about the inner workings of movement space, which I believe is what Jamise is asking about. One of the people says, how do I make sure that my rage does not consume me? And I watched them have a conversation about this, and they grappled with it. And one of the other persons said, Vahisha Hassan, Vahisha said, well, first off, you got to know what kind of fire and rage you're dealing with. Is it the
mm,
kind of fire and rage that's supposed to raise the ground, burn everything to the ground? Or is it the kind of fire that is lighting the way for the future?
mm,
And is it perhaps that there's a transition moment where sometimes you got to burn everything to the ground, and then there's another moment in which that same rage, that same fire lights the way forward?
mm,
Taking seriously um, not just what we feel, but what we feel as sources of information about how we want to be together. Those are some of the ways in which I noticed them talking about what it is to be well. They're also talking about Black futures, which is a question that I asked them. I tend to want to ask them, so I know you're in this for a reason, but what do you want it to look like?
mm,
Right? And so they're spending a lot of time around Black joy and Black futures. They're spending a lot of time around resting, organizing themselves so that they can rest, not because they're lazy, And not because they don't know that there's more work to do, but they trust that rest is the resource to be able to give them a space to get in touch with the Black futures that they're fighting for.
There is a question. Oh, well, Joy says, thank you. That was
Hey, Joy.
and there is a question from Anne. Before I give Anne's question, I want to apologize, Sister Bailey, if I mispronounced your name. I have a different stream that I'm looking at, and before it comes up onto the screen, so behind the scenes, I've got a difference, and so my apologies. But Anne Hill, what are your views about people of color being removed from government positions?
My eyeball clicked for a second. So I was just reading, watched a piece, a news piece that just talked about the amount of Black women who have been removed from the labor force, laid off, often many of them in government positions. So I'm not entirely sure what the question, and I would love if there's a second part to the question for
Mhm.
clarification, but
I
my
don't
views are
see
that
any.
for one.
Okay, if I see one, I will mention it. I don't see it on the stream I
Okay,
have.
thank you. Part of what I will say is that when you don't want diversity, you remove diversity.
Mm,
When you only want one way of thinking, and also only want to affirm a particular community, you remove anybody who's an obstacle to that.
mm,
And so when it comes to removing people of color from government positions, and I'm assuming they mean within the current administration here in the US, I think it's an intentional move, first of all, to shut down accountability. Second of all, to displace people and then blame their race for being the reason why they were displaced.
mm,
Although we also know that there were several white people who were displaced, especially at the beginning of last year, right?
mhm,
So I think part of it is to create one voice and less accountability. It also is a blow that people of color are, being disproportionately removed from positions that then has a ripple effect financially and
mm,
will have an impact generationally. The amount of people who have been, and this concerns government jobs, but also when I look at other sectors, what we are seeing right now with the erasure of history of people of color, the removal of people from their positions, the dismantling of DEI, what we're seeing right now is going to have a generational impact, even though it's only been a year. The way that schools, at one point, the amount of schools that had to not allow incoming classes, the declassification of certain professional fields as professional fields that oftentimes were filled by persons of color.
mhm.
This is
Yes.
a generational impact. It has a generational impact that will be financial, but it's also something past finances, right?
Mm,
You're
mm,
removing an entire layer and generation of people. So the children who are coming up will see fewer people who look like them in positions of power and authority, while they will also inherit the narratives, which I talked about before, about lack, about we were okay and now we don't have anything, the instability that it is creating within families, within houses, within communities. The instability is one of the places that I'm most aware of the impact of these kinds of
mm.
changes.
Well, I have to give a commercial before we close up.
Thank you.
Because I just got a note that we are really at time. But again,
Okay.
to everyone who is watching, first, I want to say thank you for joining us for book notes and this conversation with Dr. Stephanie Crumpton. We want you to pick up a copy of We Gonna Be All Right. Now, this is what I want to ask that you would do. The author did not ask me to do this, but I want to ask that you would purchase from a
Mm,
Black bookstore or a local bookstore or a woman-owned bookstore, that you would purchase from a local bookstore. I know Amazon is easy, but
mhm,
if you want to see your community develop, purchase from one of the wonderful local bookstores in your neighborhood, wherever you are. So shout out to folks in Atlanta. Y'all got a bookstore there. Shout out to folks in California. You got a bookstore there. Shout out to people in Indiana. Drive over to Chicago. I'm not sure what's going on over there. But make sure that you pick up a copy and purchase from a local bookstore, not necessarily a chain, a local bookstore. We thank none other than Dr. Stephanie Crumpton, who teaches at McCormick Theological Seminary. For those who are in discernment around going to seminary, you need to think about McCormick, and you need to take a class with none other than Dr. Stephanie Crumpton. It has been a delight to be with you this evening, Dr. Crumpton. I'm not sure if your mom is on, but could we wave at
Oh,
mom?
she is.
She is?
Oh,
okay. I love
she
you,
and
Mom.
a few others. I know. We are glad to be loved by you all. But oh yes, there's a whole collective.
Well, Mom, we are glad that you are on supporting your daughter this evening. We thank you, Dr. Crumpton, for being with us for this conversation. I want to thank the entire team. Matter of fact, let's do this. I usually don't do this. I'm going to ask that the team would just come on for a moment, because you all were working behind the scenes as we receive some news, and we are praying for Brother James. And once you all just come on for a moment and wave, please, could we do that just for a second? All these people who are behind the scenes, they do all of the work. We are so very grateful for each of you producing the book notes. And once again, we thank you for being with us this evening. We hope you will join us for our next book notes. We lift up Brother James in prayer. You can pass this on YouTube and on Facebook and share it with other people, as it will be on YouTube in perpetuity. And we thank you, Dr. Crumpton, for being with us this evening for book notes.
Thank you for having me.